salt. The salt that brings out the taste of foods. Only Oliver is available as snow white flakes ready for your kitchen table. Oliver salt is produced by the natural power of the sun. Oliver salt is 99 and 95/100% pure sodium chloride. You can't find a purer salt anywhere. Try Oliver salt, mild because it's pure. Salt harvest in the evaporating ponds of San Francisco Bay has been taking place for over 100 years. Tractors, trains, and train tracks are moved onto the crusty salt ponds. Must work hard to finish the harvest before the autumn rains come. The salt is scraped from the bottoms of immense salt ponds. Oliver Brothers plant, time is running out. The economics of salt production means this may be one of the last of the yearly harvests. Oliver Brothers Salt Company is the last of the old-time salt families remaining around San Francisco Bay. The multi-million-dollar corporations have taken over the business. Alden Oliver visits the plant daily to supervise men and equipment. He is semi-retired, but his plant is still producing about 10,000 tons of salt annually. Alden Oliver was born and raised on the salt market of Oliver's producing salt along the Bay shoreline. Salt is used commercially. Huge trucks fill up with salt at the plant. In the late 1800s, Oliver Brothers produced table salt as well as the coarser commercial grades. San Francisco Bay provides salty water to be evaporated until only crystallized salt is left. The marshes around San Francisco Bay offer one of the best locations for salt production on the Pacific coast. Bay Area climate is ideal.
That is why this San Francisco Bay Area has become such a great salt area, is because of our mild climate. Everybody says, well, why don't they do it up in Seattle and Portland? But there it's a matter of rainfall in the summertime during their evaporating periods. We have just drained this pond prior to harvesting it, and we're in the process of laying our tracks. You'll notice that we started down that corner and we're coming around. We'll go completely around the pond and go out that side.
Little train cars transport the salt from the ponds to the processing plant. An elaborate washing process cleans the salt. After washing, a conveyor belt carries the salt high above the plant where it is shot off into an enormous pile. Looking out over this salt area today, it is hard to believe that 30 families and hundreds of workers once made their homes here. The salt area was developed in pioneer days by dozens of enterprising families. The natural marshes along the shoreline were diked off to form small ponds where salty bay water would evaporate. Water transportation was essential to the early salt industry. Bayside landings were constructed all along the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay. The social and commercial center for the early salt makers was a little town called Mount Eden. Oliver Brothers had their main office at Mount Eden, but also had an office in San Francisco.
The headquarters were in Mount Eden, but we had an office in San Francisco. And we also had a warehouse down at Pier 17 where we used to keep a small supply of various grades of salt for small users around the city. Come in and pick up 1 to 5 tons of various kinds of salt.
The early Bay Area salt industry grew with San Francisco. Many industries depended on salt. The discovery of gold and silver in the West would lead to one of the most important uses of salt. The problem for early miners was how to remove the precious metals from the ores. A process was developed which used salt to help separate out gold and silver.
Who did the Olivers sell salt to?
Well, our big trade was with the fishing people. We had an agent in Seattle who was in the fishing business himself, and as a result had contacts with various people in British Columbia, Alaska, down to Portland, and then, of course, San Francisco, the Alaska Packers, which later became California Packing Corporation, took over, had a fleet of boats that always left from here for Alaska. We used to have all of their business, and the Union Codfish Company that had a processing plant over in Redwood City, they used to take all their salt from us.
What sort of uses were made of Oliver salt?
The making of ice was really a big item, and also for the refrigeration of vegetables going east. They used ice to refrigerate in all the old refrigerator cars, and they always added some salt in to get the temperature down.
Salt had dozens of uses in old California. Salt was essential in candy making. Soft drinks tasted sweeter with salt added. Salt was used in the making of soap. Well-dressed Californians depended on salt in surprising ways. Salt was essential for the tanning of leather for shoes. Salt was used in the dyeing and strengthening of fabrics. One of the big challenges to early salt makers was how to transport salt to markets in San Francisco.
What kind of boats were used for hauling the salt?
Of course, in the early days, it was all scooters, sailing scooters and scows. But in later days, of course, we went to tugboats and barges.
Oliver Brothers had their own tug and bayside landing. But there was always a danger of becoming stranded in the shallow bay at low tide.
I know when I was working in San Francisco, on several occasions, I'd be down to check the boats coming in to load for the north, and none in sight, and go back to the office and telephone the plant down here. Our shipping clerk would say, wait a minute, and he would go up on top of the plant, and he'd look out with his glasses, and he says, well, they got stuck out in the bay last night going to San Francisco, so they won't be in until tonight's tide.
The first salt ponds were constructed by Augustus Johnson around 1854. When the Olivers began in the 1880s, Chinese crews using hand labor were still employed to build ponds and collect salt.
The time after the railroad was built, there was an excess of Chinese help, and as a result, most of the salt ponds in the early days were built by the Chinese.
Well, then we're surrounded by a number of salt ponds right here that look fairly shallow right now. When were these constructed?
These are some of the original Johnson ponds that were made in the old days of hand labor.
Was there any reason for the salt ponds being smaller than they are now?
The reason was that they were all harvested by hand, and the salt was either packed out or it was wheeled out in wheelbarrows. So, and in between each pond they had a storage area where they piled it. The men used to go out and they had wooden shoes on that were about 12 by 12 that looked like a snowshoe, with a strap over them and a shovel, and they went out and they prepared the ponds, and wherever there'd be small indentations or anything else, they would shovel some dirt in and then pat them down.
The windmills of San Francisco Bay are the proud symbol of generations of early salt makers. The mills provided power to pump water from pond to pond. Today, the mills sit silently in the ponds and tremble as ocean breezes touch them. At the base of each windmill is a large wooden screw which operated on the same principle as a home meat grinder. As the mill turned, water was raised up through the wooden screw from lower ponds to higher ponds. Windmills of all sizes and shapes decorated the ponds at the turn of the century. Each windmill was carefully constructed by hand. Today, most of the old mills and screws lie in the marsh.
These pieces of wood were placed in here to form the screw. And then, of course, this was all closed in with wood so that the water came in, went on around and out the end over there. Incidentally, these were all made by hand.
The marsh hides other old machines like this wooden roller.
This is an old roller that was used mainly to the spring of year to compact the the roads and whatnot, and as they were shoveled in from the winter rains, why there'd be holes and chuck holes in them, and then this would be pulled over to solidify the material in the chuck holes.
San Francisco had become the commercial center of the West in the 1800s. To celebrate the commercial and industrial growth of the city, the Great Panama Pacific Exposition was held in 1915. Alden Oliver recalls this great event of his youth.
That was where I had my first hot dog. Alameda County had a display there, and various salt people had exhibits, and we furnished some of our table salt that we were making at that time, which was marketed under Magnolia brand.
Alden Oliver still keeps one of the souvenir exposition bags. The First World War quickly darkened the bright spirit of the Panama Exposition. By the time of the war, Oliver Brothers had become one of the strongest of the Bay Area salt producers.
What happened to Oliver Salt during World War I?
During World War I, they went into the chemical business, and because of the fact that some of the chemicals that we were getting from Europe were not available, and they set up to make some magnesium chloride and some of the other chemicals, and they had a chemical plant.
The Oliver chemical business played out its role quickly, and the Olivers continued to produce salt. Industrial and agricultural growth was taking place throughout the state. San Francisco was no longer the sole center of commerce. Oliver Brothers gained a new independence from San Francisco when it developed methods to process salt in the marshes of Alameda County.
And the Olivers put up this small plant and found that by putting a little fresh water on the salt, they could get it perfectly dry out here and bag it here and ship it as a dried salt from the marshes here.
A rapidly growing use for salt was in the canning and food processing industry. The canning industry centered in Alameda County.
When Hunt's combined with California Conserving Company, which is now they call it the B Street plant, they processed a lot of cucumbers in that plant. And they also used some of our salt in there, making tomato ketchup at the A Street plant.
In 1926, Oliver Brothers sold the salt business and devoted their time to agriculture. But in 1937, the family bought back into the salt-making business and found themselves in a new era of Bay Area industrial growth.
This place was offered to sale, and at that time we were farming, and thinking back to the salt industry, what a good industry it was, and so forth. We were probably over about buying this. However, it really was too small an operation. However, in those days, smaller operations could exist, but today it's a thing of the past.
When the Olivers bought back into the salt business in the late 1930s, electric power was in service in all parts of the Bay Area. It would be electric power that would drive the salt pumps in coming years. Salt processing technology was improving by the time Oliver Brothers built their new plant by the San Mateo Bridge. The plant is a maze of gears and conveyor belts that looks like a Hollywood cartoon creation. By the 1930s, salt was being valued not in its familiar crystalline form, but for its two constituents, sodium and chlorine. The automobile illustrates the new ways that modern industry uses the components of salt. Ethyl gasoline depends on sodium derived from salt for its manufacture. The window glass in a car and its steel frame are both produced by industrial techniques which utilize sodium. Today, salt is as important for the sodium and chlorine it yields as it is for the common crystals in the household salt shaker. Alden Oliver has continued the tradition of the family-run salt maker. Though the end of this tradition seems near, Oliver Salt has continued to operate and innovate. Few industries have had so profound an impact on the Bay Area's landscape.
Alden, what machine was most influential in forming this area?
Of course, the big thing was the building of levees with dredges. In 1904, my dad brought back down the first dredge from the Sacramento River area. These dredgers were able to build levees 6 and 8 feet high and 20 and 30 feet wide, whereas in the old hand levees they were 3 to 4 feet wide and 2 to 3 feet high.
100 years of salt pond making has had a profound influence on Bay Area geography. Oliver Brothers Salt has obtained much of its equipment from California clay plants.
And you have a little, looks like a little train there.
That's a Plymouth locomotive that's pushing this car rail ahead, and that's one of the locomotives that'll haul the cars of salt out after we get the rail all hooked up.
The most noticeable feature of the salt ponds is their color. They are often red, but sometimes appear to be yellow or green.
Alden, the water here looks very, very red. What does that mean?
That means that it's very heavy in algae. This is an algae that forms when the salt is in the being crystallized. We don't know too much about it.
The family-run salt companies have disappeared, except for Oliver. But the days are numbered, even for Oliver Brothers.
Well, the Oliver Brothers Salt Company is too small a concern to be able to consider to continue to operate. We are going to have to find some way of phasing the situation out, and that's the reason we've been working with Brine Shrimp to try to help out the salt business, but between the two of them, it still is too small a concern to continue to operate.
Although he thinks that closing down the salt plant is inevitable, Alden Oliver continues his daily schedule of production and maintenance. In an age of large corporations, Oliver Brothers Salt Company is a living symbol of the enterprising spirit that created one of the largest solar evaporation salt areas in the world.